for justice after industrial pollution in the town seriously affected their health.
And it was one of the UK's worst environmental scandals. And today, in a special investigation, we find out how thousands more sites across the country have been found to be contaminated and consider the potential risks.
The recent Netflix drama Toxic Town tells the story of families in Corby fighting for justice after their children were born with birth defects caused by toxic waste from a former steelworks in the town.
That is 4 of us, all with the same thing at the same time.
It shows them taking Corby Borough Council to the High Court, a case they eventually won in 2009. It sounds like the stuff of fiction, but this drama is based on very real events. What happened in Corby became one of the UK's biggest ever environmental scandals. And far from being an isolated case, in recent years it's become increasingly clear that more people across Britain are living on or near contaminated land that could be posing a risk to their health. Recent research by the BBC's Shared Data Unit found that there are more than 13,000 potentially toxic sites in England, Scotland and Wales identified by councils as high risk. These could be former mines, factories or landfills. One of the main concerns about historic landfills is that before the 1990 Environmental Protection Act, which enforced safer practices, record keeping of hazardous waste was patchy. When Kai Bangbola and Nicole Lawler bought their Victorian home in 2004, they had no idea that just metres from their property was a historic landfill site. This information only came to light in the worst imaginable circumstances, following the death of their 7-year-old son, Zane. Tell me about Zane.
Zane brought love and joy from the moment that he was born.
He was just the love of our lives, wasn't he? And I miss him every second of the day.
In February 2014, the UK was in the grip of a major storm. And like many others sitting on the banks of the River Thames, Zane's family home wasn't spared.
The house, it has a flood basement, so as the water passed across the land, it was flowing underneath the house.
In the early hours of February 8th, Nicole began to feel unwell and decided to check on Zane.
Nicole found Zane and collapsed and was screaming for me. I was only 6 foot away from where Zane was, but I couldn't hear because I was in cardiac arrest.
First responders were unable to resuscitate Zane, who was also in cardiorespiratory arrest, and he was later pronounced dead in hospital. Against the odds, Kai survived, but was left paraplegic.
The fire brigade detected hydrogen cyanide in the home, and the whole area needed to be evacuated.
The inquest into Zane's death confirmed the detection of hydrogen cyanide at the property, albeit at low levels. A Freedom of Information request shared with the BBC revealed hydrogen cyanide had been detected 3 times at the property that night, and that long-term exposure could lead to cardiac arrest. However, Zane's inquest concluded he had died from carbon monoxide poisoning from a petrol pump the family had hired to tackle the floodwaters in their home. Kai and Nicole say the pump was not in use.
The fire brigade did 3 sweeps for carbon monoxide and none was found.
It was only after a 2014 BBC News report that Kai and Nicole learned the presence of an historic landfill site in an area called Abbeyfield next to their home. At the time, Surrey County Council denied the landfill existed.
Abbeyfield is a landscape lake area created as a result of mineral excavation and has not been a landfill site.
But at Zane's inquest in 2016, the landfill was confirmed. The BBC has seen documents revealing experimental testing took place there in 1962, but specific details remain a mystery. Kai and Nicole maintain their house was poisoned from floodwaters bringing in deadly hydrogen cyanide gases from the landfill.
Zane was to the world one person, but to us he was the world, and that's why we survived, to be Zane's voice.
There are more than 20,000 historic landfills in the UK, meaning many of us are likely to live near one. Professor Kate Spencer from Queen Mary's University in London has been studying these sites for more than a decade.
There are tens of thousands of these old sites, and the vast majority of them are going to be absolutely safe. And it's probably a very small number that perhaps contain materials that might be particularly at risk from something like flooding.
What kinds of things might have been put into historic landfill?
They can include things that are really completely harmless, but it could contain things like asbestos, chemicals that we've perhaps now banned. But the problem that we've got at the moment is we don't know which ones they are.
With so many historic sites, I want to find out what legal protections there are for home buyers and owners. Aaron Elcock works for the property conveyancing firm SAM. Imagine for a second I'm buying a house. How can I be sure that it's not next to some contaminated land?
When you buy, typically you'll get property searches that will flag local environmental hazards. If flagged, contaminated land isn't always a major concern. The environmental agency of the council can either tell you, is it currently contaminated, or the land was remediated. The other option being, you could get an indemnity policy, and this would protect the lender in the event the land is contaminated.
Whilst potentially contaminated land like historic landfill should be identified and, if necessary, remediated by local authorities, campaigners argue that progress is slow. The recent BBC Shared Data Unit investigation showed that only 1 in 10 of the high-risk sites had been inspected. Nicole and Kai are now calling for an independent panel inquiry into the circumstances surrounding Zane's death, a plea supported by 34 MPs in February last year. They also want a change in the law.
So what Zane's law will position is a registration and proper assessment of these areas of land causing harm.
We have to make sure that this prevents future deaths.
It is only right as a legacy to Zane.
It was incredibly moving to meet Kai and Nicole, who are trying to turn the tragedy of their son's death into a force for positive change. Join me in part 2, when I'll be visiting the community that's recently discovered their town is blighted by contamination.
Yeah, lots to take in there, and as Nick was saying, we'll get back to part 2 in about 20 minutes' time. Just to pick up on something there, Nick, there has now been a summit for Zane's Law at Parliament. You and the Morning Live team were there, weren't you?
Yeah, it was such a privilege to be invited along. It was at the House of Lords Wednesday last week, and a lot of incredibly powerful testimony from families like the Bangbolas and from campaigners as well, who maintain that their lives have been profoundly affected by contaminated land. The Environment Secretary of State, Steve Reid, was there as well, and he did seem to respond positively to what the campaigners were saying.
Yeah, well, look, at this point, we have had a response to this film. We've heard from Spelthorne Borough Council, which covers that area. It says it has the utmost sympathy for the Bangola's family loss. It and Surrey County Council told us they had no further comments to add beyond the coroner's report from 2016.
The Department for Food and Rural Affairs told us it's commissioned a new State of Contaminated Land report, which will help provide the best data to measure future policies. It added that local authorities have a statutory duty to inspect potentially contaminated sites, and its thoughts remain with the Bangbola family.